Today, maybe China is the most hated country in the world, or has one of the. It's like all the reporting about China is very negative nowadays. And at that time, it was totally the contrary. China became very fashionable at the time. After 1978, after Mao Zedong died, they had this opening policy, and they were opening up for globalization. And there was this, so there was a huge China fashion at the time. And so when I started Chinese studies in the previous year in Bonn University, there were 30 people who had enrolled. And then when I studied, there were 300. So from within 1 year, it had increased tenfold. And so that just shows that, I was just basically following a general trend at the time.
Recently, actually, I read that some universities, Chinese universities and cultural centers outside of China have been targeted by the U.S. government. Why though?
What do you mean by targeted?
The U.S. government say that they are communist infiltration centers, essentially.
Oh, you mean maybe the Confucius Institute?
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah, and I think 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that would be unthinkable. People were like, "Oh my God, beautiful! This educational center, we're gonna go there." But now it's oh, terrible things.
Exactly. Yeah, that's one symptom of the general China scare right now, right? And so it's kind of interesting. The only thing, everyone hates Trump if they are kind of on the left or half left, but everyone just follows Trump's anti-China politics, even if they're on the left, right? So if there's something in the West where there's an agreement on, then it's this kind of anti-China stance. I understand, and the things in China are getting worse, there's no doubt, and you can feel this here too, but generally...
How worse?
China is getting much more defensive. One example, of course, is the situation in Hong Kong, right? They perceived, rightly so, that Hong Kong was kind of on the verge of breaking up from China. And they saw it, and then they have all these countermeasures with a new new laws that make it illegal to basically say things against the Chinese government and things like this. So generally the political climate has become much more tense in recent years in China, and that's unfortunate. So
more nationalistic.
Much more nationalistic as a reaction to the Western kind of more aggressive stance towards China. So in turn, they become much more self-assertive.
How do you see social philosophy or Chinese philosophers that talk about these issues?
Well, inside of China, both political and philosophical and generally socio-political discussions used to be very lively. I always experienced them as more diverse and more lively than actually in Europe or in Germany. There was but I'm saying this in the past tense, right? Because I'm not sure how the situation is nowadays. As I said, the situation has changed in the past 2 or 3 years, and people have to be more cautious about what they are saying. But prior to that, you can buy all kinds of books in the bookstores, and you have all kinds of Western philosophers going to China, and you have all these Chinese students going everywhere in the West. And it was a very diverse discussion where you had many, many different viewpoints being present at the same time. And there was very little government interference, as long as you wouldn't directly challenge the government, right? As long as you wouldn't be calling for regime change or so. There was, particularly at the universities, there was a lot of freedom until very recently. But as I said, in recent years, and that's a very recent development, I'm talking about the past 1 or 2 years, it's getting more and more strict. Fortunately, not so much here in Macau, right? Macau is like Hong Kong. We have different government. We have a large degree of autonomy, and Chinese people actually need a visa to come here. And
really?
I cannot. Yes, so they have this one country, two systems thing, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so it has a very high degree. It has its own currency. It has its own legal system, and so forth, right? And right now at the Olympics, I mean, Macau is so small they have no athletes, but anyway, yeah. But Hong Kong is competing there under their own flag and as their own thing. So Macau does have like it's very autonomous, but yeah, all this is now in the process of slowly changing, unfortunately, because of the developments in Hong Kong last year.
And do you see yourself in China in the next years?
If I will stay in China?
Yes, in the next years.
Yeah, I have to stay. I mean, I have my job here, and I hope I can, I hope to stay on for many years here. I like the place. As I said, my background is Chinese studies, and it's for me, it's a very good environment for someone who does Chinese philosophy, and I like the city very much. So, of course, I hope I will be able to stay here as long as possible. And I should maybe also mention that it's one of the richest places in the world. So it's a very comfortable place to live in. Unlike Mexico, there's basically no violent crime. So that's also, of course, increases the quality of living, right? It's a very safe place.
Well, that's a very low bar. Like any place is better than Mexico in that regard.
Unfortunately, maybe that's so, yes.
Yes, well, I actually have read some people that say that you don't know what modernity is till you go to China. And you see all these great changes that outside China are weird or unthinkable. So I would like you to talk us about some of the things you have seen in that regard. Is this true? Is this...
I think that's absolutely true. And I think, I mean, one of the misconceptions of China in the West is that they don't really recognize this, right? As I said, like I was in China for the first time in the 1980s when China just began to modernize. And of course, at that time, compared to Western standards, China was extremely poor. And it was still not compared like with still much better than India because you didn't have like you have in many other places, you didn't have whatever favelas, or you didn't have like mass poverty, you didn't have starvation, you didn't have crime, but generally the standard of living was compared with Europe, where I come from, very low, right? And then within a few decades, China extremely modernized. You go now, the most modern cities are now in China. If you go to Shanghai or so, and you feel like you're in a science fiction movie or something like this, right? But this is not only just for a few rich people, right? It's like hundreds of millions of people who got like elevated from poverty levels, right? So it's amazing that a non-Western society, a formerly colonized society, mentioned to allow hundreds of millions of people to emerge from poverty and to basically catch up with Western living standards in such a short period of time. And so that is unprecedented in the world. And it also shows you, which I think is a good thing, how socialism can actually function, right? Of course, I mean, Chinese communism was changed then, and they have all this through, strong capitalist elements in the society, yes. But at the same time, unlike in the US or so, you still have all these public education for hundreds of millions of people. That is kind of top class now. You have like a top class world which you don't have anywhere else. Public transportation, right? I mean, you're talking about modernity. So you have these trains that run at like 350 kilometers per hour through the whole country. Like, it's amazing. You don't have that anywhere else in the world, right? And it's like affordable for the majority of the population, right? And other things like, that energy and banking and so forth, this is all still very much controlled in such a way that it benefits the general development of the country. And the party rule, they are especially even though, of course, there's also now a big gap between the rich and the poorer people, but still, it's very much the aim of the society. They call it a moderately prosperous society, and they did, eliminate poverty, and they raised probably the status of the poor people on a scale that has never really happened anywhere else in the world. Yeah, so that's also kind of an alternative modernity, right? And so maybe China is one of the few examples where you have a non-Western, formally colonized a country that was like economically extremely backwards, but was managed to catch up, and not just like you have in Mexico, where you have a very small class of rich people, right? So I think some of the richest people in the world are also Mexican. But then you have like poverty and crime at an enormous extent, right? And that's simply not the case in China.
There's not so much crime in China.
There's also crime, but not much violent crime. And it's not a police state, right? It's not the case that, you have the street or everything is full of police or so. It's just generally the society has a lot of kind of cohesion, and it managed to develop in such a way that there wasn't really a need for a crime infrastructure to emerge, unlike in Mexico, right, where there are very specific reasons why why the crime and poverty are, of course, directly related.
Now, what you said about the police state, that's actually one of the misconceptions that outside China people have. Like people think China, they think like social credit, and you go to jail because you posted a Winnie the Pooh. So you would say that is completely false.
Well, it's not completely false, of course, and that's much more like in China. You have to be very careful what you say on social media or what you say online. That can easily get you into trouble. But at the same time, people say a lot of things. So it's not that people are quiet. It's very complex, the reality. But when I was talking about police state, I was talking about police presence in daily life, right? I felt, as I lived in Canada and the US for about 10 years, and I felt much more that I'm living in a police state there than I feel in China. Because, and in Mexico too, right? There's a lot of police presence on the road. There's a lot of things that are not really allowed. For instance, in the US or in Canada, you're not allowed to openly display a beer bottle on the road, right? But in China, people are very relaxed about these things, and you eat and drink outside, and it's not a problem. And so the general street life and so forth, right, and the daily life is relaxed is the wrong word, but it's not. And as I mentioned before we recorded, like the extreme opposite was Eastern Germany, where I was a teenager, where it's like you have the feeling you're entering a prison or something, right? And that's not really at all the case if you go to China, right? You do not have the feeling that you are that when you in your daily life that you are constantly kind of controlled and managed by the authorities. But again, like, it's complex. It doesn't mean that this kind of supervision of political opposition does take place, right? As I said, increasingly so recently.
Now, what would you recommend for people who want to know more about China, or maybe have some ideas about China? Like you said, you don't like Trump, would you like Trumpism? What would you recommend to those people to watch or to read to understand better?
That's a good question. I should have a little bit prepared for this because I'm very bad in remembering book titles. And there's a book called Did China Win? And the author is from Singapore and has a name that I cannot pronounce. That was a good book that I recently read about China. And then maybe just watch Chinese movies that are made by Chinese directors and that are not produced for Hollywood. Again, I'm terrible. If you had mentioned this before, I would have. I'm terrible at. I cannot memorize names of movie people, but China has a very good movie production. Just watch movies by Chinese directors that are not, as I said, produced directly for the American market, and then you get a much better picture on how contemporary China functions. And actually, now one documentary comes to mind. I think it's called American Factory. It was kind of produced with the help of President Obama at the time. And it's not directly about China. It's about how a Chinese company takes over an American company. And that's also a very interesting movie that kind of introduces, it's a documentary that introduces kind of the mutual misunderstandings between Chinese and in this case, Americans.
And politics is completely...
Politics, yes.
I remember something you said once, that it was like politics is no longer about politics, about profits. Politics is about, like the army, those politics, other people. But the politicians don't do politics. I remember you said in an interview.
Absolutely, yes. Politics is also entirely changed to profile politics, right? It's a competition between different profiles. And we see this now also in America, like always, like the most important thing. I mean, there's not much difference between the actual policies of Biden and Trump. But the profile difference is immense. There's a huge profile difference, and people hate one another on both sides because they so strongly identify with the different profiles, which is kind of ridiculous because actually politically they're not even that far apart. Yeah, I mean, Naomi Klein, we also talk about her in the book, who wrote like 20 years ago, it's a long time ago, a very good No Logo, right?
No Logo.
Which is about logos, brands, right? And in marketing. But she already said that, of course, politics is basically following this model of marketing that consists in branding. And in the West, politics is basically branding politics, by the way, which makes it very different from China. And I think that's also one of the reasons I was thinking about this in recent weeks more and more. Why is particularly America now? I mean, Biden is as much as anti-China as Trump is. And I think one of the reasons is because China actually does real politics. They do still. The government is actually, they don't have a competitor, right? They're not in a profile competition within China, so they justify themselves. Right? The Chinese government also has, which Westerners often do not know, they have, like Putin has in Russia, they have very high approval ratings, much higher than the governments in the West. Right? And of course, the main reason for this is what I mentioned earlier, that the government did a relatively, or actually not only relatively, did a very good job in raising the living standards of the population, so that unlike in most other countries, the younger people have much more opportunities than the older people, because a big problem in the West is that the younger people don't really have any opportunities or good opportunities in society, and particularly not better opportunities than the older generation. So and somehow the West is in decline, but the West still have to sell itself in particular to its own people as a success story, right? And so the American politics, against the facts, has to sell itself as the best country in the world, as a political success story, which, actually speaking, is a very dubious claim, given the poverty, the crime, the injustice, the wars, right? It's ridiculous.
Yes.
It's not a great record that they have. And particularly if you see the development in the past 30, 40 years, where the income has declined for large segments of the society, yes. Right? Not only the poor are getting poorer, also the middle class is getting significantly poorer. So the system isn't really working greatly. Again, but they're not making politics. and they're just still and they win on profile building an election. Now in China it's different. They don't have elections, so they don't have to. They don't have to engage in that kind of legitimacy building. The legitimacy of the Chinese government is built by delivering politics that somehow make the people accept an authoritarian government. That is their task. The government is authoritarian. No one likes an authoritarian government, right? The government makes human rights violations and so forth, and yet the people are willing to accept that and approve of it to a certain extent. Why is that? Because they actually make politics that benefit large parts of the population, unlike in the US. So it's kind of absurd that a government like China, in order to, which it also needs to maintain and achieve like support from the people, needs to actually make politics, right? That's the only way in which they can kind of justify their authoritarian, to a certain extent, repressive system, because they deliver. And that's why people are willing to put up with it.
So you would say
in the West, it's the opposite. In the West, it's the opposite. They don't deliver, but they are very good in creating a successful profile.
So you would say that in China, the profile of the government's profile, is backed up by these improvements in life, etc., and in the US, in Europe, the profile of the government's profile is backed up not by that, but by nothing.
No, by giving the people, it's like Naomi Klein said, it's basically successful branding. This functions like a brand, and it functions in competition with another brand. So people are just happy that Biden wins the election, and that kind of confirms their self-image and so forth.